this talk. It's really been a pleasure visiting the university. Athens, really amazing city. So my talk today is about exploring dependence and multivariate time series. And this is joint work primarily with Marco Pinto from Oslo Met in Norway. And some of this is also, some of the work here is actually in collaboration with other students currently at KAUST. So this is the overview of our research. So suppose that we have a network of time series. So we have locations in the brain where we collect time series data. So we have, let's say, P locations, and our goal is to characterize dependence in the network. So there's no one unique way to characterize dependence. So at the end of the day, we'd like to be able to say something about when activity in one region of the brain is high, what is the impact of that on the activity on another part of the brain? So this kind of a problem is common for financial data, every kind of data, so something happens in a country or in a particular stock, what is the impact of that on other stocks in the future? Is there an excitation, inhibition, or nothing? Okay? But again, that's a very vague and general question. So how do you measure these changes? So what we've been doing is really finding ways to characterize or describe that dependence. And then we work with high-dimensional networks. So for example, for electroencephalogram data, you may have 64 or 256 channels on the scalp. And if you're looking at functional MRI data, then that's 100,000 different locations in the brain, 100,000 voxels. So it's high dimensional. And you'll see too that signals that are close together, especially for fMRI, they tend to behave in a similar way. And if they behave in a similar way, then this suggests that perhaps we can project high dimensional signals onto a lower dimensional space. So you represent them by lower dimensional signals. So this is one of the things we're working on, but I won't focus on that today. And then the other is that of spectral causality. So I'll just talk about that, when we get there towards the end. And then another important part of our project is to track dependence in real time. So of course, there is the most common way to study dependence is if you collect data beginning to end. After you're done with the collection, then you retroactively analyze the data and see what happens. But very often you want to be able to track dependence and changes as they occur. Rather than wait for the entire data to be collected, I want to see them as they happen. So of course, once you work into real-time tracking, you're dealing with high-dimensional data, then you have to be aware of the computational challenges that are associated with that. Okay, so this is the overview of our work. So this is just a cartoon. So this is a bit sideward. So this is the skull of the brain, the skull. This is the skin, and on the skin you have these sensors, channel 1, channel 2. But whatever signal you get here is actually a result of the propagation of neuronal activity, usually on the cortex. So but you don't observe that directly. Okay? So, but then this is propagated onto the scalp, okay? And we collect data through these sensors. So how do we characterize dependence? So here, if I have signals x1 and x2, I want to model dependence between them. But here I will present a framework that it's really quite obvious, but not a lot of people have thought about it that way, even though many of our classical measures of dependence can be explained along those terms. So to me, this is a bit more intuitive, so I'd like to proceed along these lines. So instead of looking at dependence between x1 and x2, one way to do that is to decompose your signal into different components. So if I stick with Fourier for the moment, there's not one unique decomposition, but if I stick with Fourier, we can think about, okay, here is my low frequency component of my signal, higher frequency. So interestingly, it's all Greek. So delta is 0 to 4 hertz. Theta is 4 to 8 cycles per second. This is the a nomenclature in EEGs. And then you have this alpha band. So alpha is 8 to 12 hertz. Beta is 12 to 32, and gamma is 32 and over. Okay? So low, middle, high frequency. So instead of modeling dependence directly from X1 and X2, we can decompose them, and we can model dependence through these different oscillations. So suppose, for example, that I look at cross correlation between X1 and X2. And I say that, oh, the cross correlation is high. So there's a high level of linear dependence. So that is informative. But the other question, the next question is, what is the frequency oscillation that drives that dependence? And so this is what we're trying to answer. So this is the spectral decomposition. So as I said, there's no unique way of decomposing a signal. So if this is Fourier, you can look at other types of filters. You can look at wavelets, wavelet packets. There are many ways. Okay, so but I'll be working with Fourier because of the nice interpretability here. And so I'll just these are just examples of the different frequency oscillations you'll see. So this is for the delta, the beta, and the gamma. So as I was saying earlier, here we have EEG data coming from two channels. This is from the left frontal. And then O2 is on the right occipital. So on the visual cortex area, frontal lobe, occipital lobe. And so if I look at the correlation between them, so this is the correlation of negative 0.547 between these two channels. Oops. Did I? Sorry. For all of a sudden, it stopped responding.
Can you do it with the mouse? Maybe the battery.
Oh, let's see. Yep, maybe I'll just.
Always the arrows.
Yes.
Up and down.
Yeah. Don't worry. I'll work on the
Maybe
arrows.
the battery.
Yes. So now here I also now we look at we decompose these two signals. So now I'm looking at the theta waves. So theta is 0 to 4. So on the left-hand side, this is the theta waves coming from the left frontal, theta waves coming from the right occipital. And if you cross-correlate them, then you get a coherence of positive 0.41. You also do the same for beta, the same for all the different frequency bands. And so here, if I look at the correlation squared and coherences, you'll see that the correlation squared is almost 0.3. But then if you look at the different frequency components, you will see that thank you very much. So here you'll see that the coherence at the theta band explains the most of that correlation. Okay. Now, these will not add up to the one on top. The reason for that is the one on top, this is the cross correlation at 0 lag. Okay. On the other hand, once you apply filtering and you compute coherence, I'll show this a little bit later, what happens is that coherence takes into account phase shifts. And so therefore it's able to capture lags between different oscillations. So, but here the point is that if we say that, oh, there's a good level of correlation between those two channels, then by looking at the spectral dependence, I'm able to identify the frequency band or bands that explain the most of that linear dependence. Okay. So now, so these are just a few of the measures that are quite classical. Okay, time domain, we know cross correlation, lag cross correlation, partial cross correlation. And here I'll focus a bit on the frequency domain. And by presenting this general framework about dependence through the filtered signals to the decompositions, then you'll see that these classical measures of dependence and the frequency may fall under that umbrella. Okay? And then I won't go into this, but if I look at coherence, partial coherence, and so on, all of these are simply capturing the second moment dependence. And it's possible that the information might go beyond just a second moment. Okay, so I want us to look at other types. Okay, so this is the very simple framework. As I said earlier, the goal is to explore dependence between x1 and x2. And the framework is, first, we decompose x1 and x2 into the different oscillations, delta, theta, all the way to gamma, low, middle, high frequencies. I do that for x1, I do that for x2. And then if I want to describe dependence between x1 and x2, then I would like to be able to describe that dependence through the different oscillations, through the different components. So I can talk about general dependence between x1 and x2. I can also talk about more specific dependence between x1 and x2. Let's say that I'm interested in the dependence between the theta oscillation in x1 and the gamma high frequency oscillation in x2. Okay, so this is a bit more specific. So this talk is based on a manuscript under review, and it's available on archive. This is joint work with Marco Pinto. So now I'd like to show how these old concepts can be described in terms of this very simple framework. So we start with a Cramier representation of a stationary signal. So x1 and x2, suppose these are zero mean stationary signals. They can be represented in terms of a linear combination of infinitely many of these Fourier functions. So here, the basis functions are the Fourier functions with random coefficients, which I'm calling just the dz1, dz2. So this interval is in fact can be thought of as approximately the sum of the different frequency oscillations. So this is the starting point, and the formal definition of coherence at frequency omega is the modulus square of the correlation between these random coefficients. So dz1, dz2, these are random coefficients. So the dependence between x1 and x2 at frequency omega is the correlation between the random coefficients modulus square. This is the classical definition of coherence. So if we look at the definitions from Brockwell and Davis or Brillinger, then this is how we define it. So to me, this is not very intuitive. And in fact, in our paper in 2008, our point was to present this in a more pedagogical way. And so this is what we did. So this was with, in 2008, the paper with Sebastian van Bellegem in IEEE. So we wanted to look at coherence from a filtering point of view. So recall that the oscillations at x1 and x2 at frequency omega can be written in terms of this. So this is the Fourier basis function. These are your waveforms with amplitudes dz1, dz2. Now the formal definition of coherence is simply the correlation between dz1, dz2 modulus squared. But now under this specific framework, the correlation between these two oscillations turned out to be simply coherence as well. The reason for that is you have these Fourier exponentials, they just cancel each other out. If you look at the complex conjugate of the other. So this is of a unit norm, they cancel each other out. And so in the end, the correlation between these oscillations is the same as the correlation between the random coefficients, and that's just coherence. And to me, it's so simple, but I think it presents a starting point on how we can further generalize dependence measures. Because then I can decompose, and I can find many other ways of modeling dependence between x1 and x2, okay? Between these frequency oscillations. So it's a very simple idea. As I said, it's very pedagogical. That's why when we submitted this to a statistics journal, it was right away rejected. And fortunately, the engineers sometimes are a bit more pragmatic, and they appreciate these different points of view as long as it's useful. And just very briefly here is that the total variance in a stationary time series, in fact, is simply the integral of the spectrum. And in this case, it's the total variance of all of the different frequency oscillations. They're all uncorrelated across frequencies. This is one of the conditions under stationarity. So the point here is that total variance in the time series is equal to approximately the sum of the total variances of all of the different frequency oscillations. And so here, if I want to model dependence between x1 and x2, because x1 can be approximated as a sum of these different oscillations, the same with x2. And so dependence between x1 and x2 can be modeled in terms of this sum. Okay? So all of these, this is the decomposition of x1 across different frequency, across different oscillations. This is out of x2. So if I model the covariance between x1 and x2, is the covariance between this sum, and under stationarity, if you have different frequencies, they have to be uncorrelated. And so the covariance of this summation between these two sums is simply the sum of the covariances, but at the same frequency bands. Okay? And so the covariance between x1 and x2 is now equal to the sum of the covariances between the omega oscillation in x1 and the omega oscillation in x2. So again, back to the point, if this covariance is high in magnitude, okay, so that's informative, but I would like to be able to identify what is a frequency band omega k that contributes the most to that covariance. So we're back to, if I look at things in the spectral domain, I'm able to get a more specific information. Okay? So if this is high in magnitude, I want to know what is omega k, or the set of k's for which that contributes the most to that covariance. Okay, so I'll just skip this. This is just a restatement. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this too. So here, this is an example of we have an EEG data recorded around the time of an epileptic seizure. So this is actually interictal. So this is the in-between seizure periods. This is ictal during the seizure period. So you see that if I look at correlation, you see all of these lines. With brain signals, typically, in general, everything is connected to everything. But if I try to be a bit more specific, then if I look at the alpha band coherence, then I can differentiate between in-between seizure and during seizure. Then you have a different network that's at play here. So alpha band, gamma band coherence. So now another measure of dependence is that of partial coherence. So the idea here is that if I have, let's say, 3 channels. Oh yeah. Go back.
Yeah. So okay, there is a difference, and this is useful. But can you find an interpretation why is that happening? Because is it connected to any cognitive function of the brain? Is there a theory like that?
Yeah. So this is during an epileptic seizure.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And typically during an epileptic seizure, you cannot generalize it from one subject to another, but you will see that this abnormality spreads over the entire brain. It's generalized typically, and so this one is only a snapshot of what's in general. But if I actually show a plot of how this network is changing across seconds, there will be changes as well. Because at the start of an epileptic seizure, you'll see that the area of the brain where the abnormality begins, you see abnormal spikes going on in that part of the brain, and it's going to be uncorrelated with the other parts. Like you cut off that, that dependence because it's abnormal. It starts there, and then as time progresses, it actually spreads throughout the brain. So this one is a longer period of seizure. That's why it's kind of summarizing everything. Yeah, so there is so seizure can spread across the entire brain.
Thank you.
Welcome.
What is here, the blue one, and what the brown one? I don't.
Oh yes. So the blue one, this is for the periods in between an epileptic seizure. So they're not necessarily normal, but these are non-seizure events. So here's the entire EEG data. There's going to be periods of time where there's an epileptic seizure. So in between those, these are called interictal periods. And the red one, it's during the seizure. So
Can I ask another question?
Sure, yes.
And do you assume that the series are stationary? So does it really make sense in terms of an episode of a seizure
Yes.
to assume stationarity? Because to me, which I'm not an expert, it would be reasonable to assume that something strange is going on and the series goes up or down. Or
Exactly. Yes.
But the assumption of stationarity makes sense.
So the definitely the EEG data during an epileptic seizure is definitely non-stationary. Definitely non-stationary. And in fact, if one does a time frequency analysis, you will see that this particular network, it's going to be changing across time.
Across time.
Yeah. So, but what we've done here is simply like to integrate across all time in a sense. So we're showing a snapshot on the average what's going on during an epileptic seizure. But if one was to do a proper time frequency analysis, then you will see that this is actually going to be changing over time. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so definitely most EEG data is non-stationary. Yeah. So now another measure of dependence is partial coherence. So if I have, let's say, 3 signals or 3 channels, and let's say that channels 1 and 2 are highly connected, however you define it. And so now comes the question, is that connection direct or is it due to a third, a lurking channel, a third channel? And so with partial coherence, you can take a look at the dependence between X1 and X2 by removing the effect of the third, fourth, fifth, and so on channels. Okay? So one way to characterize partial coherence, just like in partial correlation, is to compute the inverse of the variance covariance matrix, and then you properly standardize it. You have the pre and post multiplication, and so this is one way to characterize it. And so the work by Facets provides a way to estimate, in fact, this partial coherence from a high-dimensional matrix via regularization. Okay? But what I want is to, again, to present this, which to me from a more intuitive perspective, which is from a regression perspective. So when we want to look at partial, you want to remove, so you have X1 and X2. What we do is, if I want a partial for X3, I remove the linear component of X3 from X1. I get my residuals. I do the same, I remove X3 from X2 again, and then I cross-correlate those residuals. This is the way I think about it from a statistics point of view. And so, in fact, partial coherence using filtering can be developed exactly in that same way. So I can look at the correlation between X1 and X2, correct the components, the oscillations, given quote unquote others, whatever it is I want to correct for. Okay. So partial coherence, which this is a more classical characterization of it, then it can also be expressed in terms of this more intuitive way through the different oscillations. Now the next point is that of dual frequency coherence. So what I have shown earlier was that, as I said, under stationarity, these different components coming from the same signal, they're uncorrelated. Okay? But sometimes that may be violated. And what is of interest, for example, is the dependence not between alpha and alpha, but the alpha oscillation in one and the gamma oscillation in the other.
Won't this contradict stationarity? I mean, in the standard decomposition, different frequencies are independent.
Exactly. So in fact, if I just because you asked that question, thank you. So now we have the Loeb harmonizable processes. So in the Cromit representation, this dz omega, they're uncorrelated across frequencies. But Loeb in 1955 already showed that in fact you can develop a process where this dz of omega can be correlated between different frequencies. So so now we have to steer away from the classical Cromit representation and then rely on the Loeb representation for non-stationary processes. But the ideas are going to be the same. So one can look at the alpha oscillation in one and the gamma oscillation in the other, and you can find the dependence between them. Okay? Under stationarity, dependence, covariance correlation is 0. Okay? But under non-stationarity, it may be non-zero. So under dual frequency, under the Loeb harmonizable process, then you can define coherence between omega 1 and omega 2, between x1 and x2 at omega 1 and omega 2 to be the correlation of, this is the random amplitude for the first time series at omega 1, the random amplitude for the second time series at omega 2, the correlation modulus squared between them. This in fact is the dual frequency coherence of the Loeb under the Loeb harmonizable process. But then they can motivate the same way, and instead of looking at these random coefficients, I look at the oscillations themselves. And then I can model, I can estimate the correlation between these two modulus squared. That in fact is also the Loeb dual frequency coherence.
And this process would be second order stationary or not even second order?
Not even second order stationary. Yes. Actually, because that is while we have that question, I'll show this. So so this is how I see the generalization of these different kinds of processes. So let me explain what I have here. Okay, so first of all, this is time, and these matrices, these are the covariances or correlations between different frequency components. Under stationarity, this correlation matrix has to be diagonal. It has to be diagonal because they're uncorrelated across it. So this should be this way actually. So they have to be diagonal, and moreover, under stationarity, the dependencies between them do not change over time. That's why this and this, they're identical. If I look at locally stationary, under locally stationary, within a local period, it is still stationary. That's why this matrix is still actually diagonal. However, if I look at different time points, they can change. So you asked earlier, Panos, about the non-stationary. This is what we usually do. We have this moving window, and over each window, we model dependency and so on. And here I use different colors to denote that they can change from one time point to another. Okay, but the point is, stationary and local stationary, it is a diagonal matrix because the frequencies are actually uncorrelated. Different ones are uncorrelated. Now with harmonizable processes, then this is no longer a diagonal matrix because the omega 1 and omega 2 can be dependent. Okay, so this is no longer diagonal. However, for general harmonizable processes, if I go from different points in time, this dependent structure does not change. And so what we've generalized this to the case where one can have a locally harmonizable process, where locally it's harmonizable, but the dependent structure can change from one local temporal neighborhood into another temporal. So that's why here the colors now are different. So this is how I see the connections between these different processes. So the first one is stationary. The second one is non-stationary, but it is locally stationary. The third one is non-stationary. It's harmonized. It's called a harmonizable process. And then what we worked on with Gorostieta and Gonsax is that we generalize this to a locally harmonizable process where this dependent structure can also change from one time point to the next. So now I have about 10 or so minutes left. So one of the problems with all of these different measures is that they do not tell us about lead-lag dependence. It's very important to be able to say that if a change happens now in one particular part of the brain, then there will be a change on another part of the brain some milliseconds or some time point later. And all these measures that I've just described, under their classical representation, classical characterization, they do not offer this information of lead-lag dependence. Now, so there's work done along these lines by Bakala and Samishima in 2001. One of the most highly cited papers. I think it's pretty groundbreaking. And when I visited Sao Paulo, Bakala said that this paper was rejected by 5 journals. And finally, Biological Cybernetics accepted it, and turns out, to be one of the. It's quite highly cited, because this is quite interesting, because it's telling us how the information from channel Q flows to channel P at frequency omega, and the way he defines it is by looking at the characterization from a VAR, from a vector autoregressive model. So he has this characterization. So from channel Q, there's information flow to all the other channels, but you want to capture what is the proportion of that flows into channel P. So this is Bakala and Samishima's definition of partial directed coherence. So I will not go into that for the moment, but just go to some of the limitations of this. Number one is that Bakala and Samishima fits a temporal VAR model to the data. And of course, we have some theoretical results for, let's say, for the univariate case, that for a weakly stationary process, you can approximate this weakly stationary process by an AR of a reasonably high order, and the order is of magnitude cube root of the length of the time series. So there's work done on this, but that means you have to fit quite a high order, because an AR is a very simplified model. Right? Now, so the same thing with the VAR. And so if I fit a VAR model, a temporal VAR model to the data, then there could be some model misspecification. Maybe I did not fit an order that's high enough. Keep in mind that if I have, let's say, 100 channels, then there will be 100 squared number of coefficients for every lag. And if I have to fit a high lag, then it'll be 100 squared times the number of lag. So this can really blow up the dimensional the dimension of the parameter space can easily blow up. So that's the first criticism. The second one is that Bakala and Samishima only looks at the same frequency, looking at the alpha frequency in one channel with the alpha frequency in another channel. So we already talked about we might need to go beyond that, because you want to see how alpha can influence gamma. So therefore, that's another limitation of the Bakala and Samishima. And moreover, Bacalans and Mishima assumes that the temporal lag between XP and XQ, different channels, they're all the same. Now, what happens if looking at different frequency components, the lead lag may be different? And so therefore, these are all the limitations. I mean, I really still admire their work, but after 20 years, we think we can do more. We should do more because we have data that allow us to interrogate other features of the signal that could not be done with Bacalans and Mishima. And so here we can take a look at, let's say, if I have channel P, I'm looking at the omega k oscillation at time t, current time point. I want to see how this might be related to the omega k prime, another channel, k prime, another frequency at another channel at a future time point. And this lag may differ between different channels, between different frequency oscillations.
Is this the information you get from the phase of the cross spectrum? If you look at the cross spectrum, the phase of the is exactly there. The time lag between the information.
Correct. So if I'm looking at stationarity, right? So I'm looking at stationarity. The cross spectrum has a complex valued component, and the phase captures that exactly. Now, if I'm looking at different frequency components, for example, okay, then yeah, indeed for the stationary case, that's perfectly captured by the cross spectrum. So in the non-stationary case, that may not be the case. Yeah, so this is actually omega k prime, the blue one, different frequency. And so now, as I was saying earlier, we'd like to be able to capture the differential effect across the different frequencies. And so the procedure is this. You already described this earlier as part of the framework. Is that we apply a filter, a one-sided filter on X, and so now we obtain a filtered signal so that the spectrum, the power of this signal is concentrated only around this frequency band omega. So we have a different frequency components. And then as an alternative to the Bacalans and Mishima is that you can fit a model something like this. Okay? So earlier I criticized Bacalans and Mishima as having a Var component, but here this is also kind of like a Var as well. But I want to start, this is my starting point because here I'm looking at x1 at omega, x1 alpha frequency at time t. I want to relate this to the previous time points, lagged values, the lagged values of the alpha frequency at component of all the different channels. Okay. So I'm looking at the effect of x1, the effect of all the channels alpha on the alpha of x1 into the future. Okay. So you have this, and then you also can add the effect of the beta oscillations of all the other channels on x1 alpha, and so on and so forth. Okay. So instead of having a vector autoregressive model, which is purely temporal, so here we've increased our dimensionality because we're not modeling x1 alone on its own in general, we're modeling the alpha component of x1. How the alpha component of x1 can be explained by the alpha component of all the other channels at the previous time points, the beta components of all the other channels at previous time points, and so the gamma oscillation and so on and so forth. So you've broken down this. So if I fit a vector autoregressive model, can I write on the board here? So let's just say that we have X here is just bivariate. And let's just pick a vector autoregressive of order 1.
Oh, if you write the other way, other people on Teams can see you as well.
Oh, yeah, okay, yes.
I guess so.
Yes, let's see. Yeah, I think they can. So here, let's just say we have a bivariate time series, and then I fit a VAR model just of lag 1. Okay. Where this phi1 is just, I'm going to write this as a phi11, phi12, phi21, phi22. And this is x1 time t, x2 at time t. Okay? And so this particular coefficient explains how x2 at the previous time point loads on x1 at the current time point. Okay? And so this is fine, but with a spectral vector autoregressive model, I'm able to separate out x2 in terms of its delta component, theta component, alpha, beta, gamma, and so on. And then the same thing here. Okay? So it becomes a frequency band specific vector autoregressive model because, of course, it's important to know that x2 loads onto x1, but I want to know what part of x2 loads onto what part of x1. Is it beta affecting gamma, gamma affecting gamma, whatever? Okay? So now we have this, I would say, so this is the spectral vector autoregressive model. And then you can also make this a bit more complicated, but then you have to go through machine learning types of algorithms to be able to determine possible nonlinear relationships between these. Okay. So if you're dealing with high dimension, then there are ways to do it. Not the only way, but you can apply some regularization. So here with who they apply some regularization, and then they have to re-estimate the other coefficients whose initial estimates from the saw were not set to 0. Okay, to correct for that bias. There's Bayesian work as well. So with this spectral var, then it's more general than your usual time frequency analysis because it covers lead lag dependence and also dual frequency dependence. So with the spectral var that I had described, it covers only linear relationships, but this is a regression model. You can make it to be as general as you wish. And in fact, now so what we're doing with another student is that we're looking at how x1 alpha may depend on x2 gamma, and this coefficient may depend on other channels as well. Maybe that dependence is governed by other channels. But then we're estimating that using deep neural networks. So I think I can, in the interest of time, it's almost 1 o'clock. I just want to add that one should look perhaps at other nonlinear relationships. And so when I think of covariance, if it's a zero mean random variable, so the covariance is simply the expectation of the product of x and y. But perhaps for nonlinear relationships, we might have to look at some functional of x1 and some functional of x2. Okay. So we have to look at all types of dependence, not just the. So in the case of correlation, covariance, coherence, H1 and H2 are simply identity functions, but we might have to look beyond that. So we have a code, a standalone software that you can download, and just very briefly here too is that most of these dependent measures that I described are global in the sense that if we look at coherence, is the expectation of the product, and suppose it's zero mean, but this expectation is an integral over the entire two-dimensional Euclidean space. But sometimes you might have to consider the possibility that the dependence can change across the entire distribution. So the dependence between x1 and x2 at the center values may be different at the tails, at the extreme values. And so we have to be able to characterize that spectral dependence at the extremes. And so this is joint work with Guerrero and Husser. So Guerrero is our PhD student. So here, if I look at a reference channel, and so just as a cartoon, you have low frequency oscillations, a bit higher, and then a bit, I'm sorry, this is a low amplitude, high amplitude, moderate amplitude. What we try to study here is that depending on the reference channel, if it's low amplitude, high, or middle, the dependence across the entire network can change. And so we want to see, depending, conditional on this reference channel, conditional on its amplitude, we want to see how the dependence across the blue dots in the network can also change. And so this is, we're looking at the extreme spectral dependence, again, looking at the different frequency oscillations. So then I can end here. I'd like to thank again Professor John Cornack for building the connection between me and your department, and of course Ioannis for the hospitality and statistics department at AUEB. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hernando, for this very interesting talk. So, are there any questions for Hernando, either from the audience or from people on Teams?
Maybe I'll make a start. Thanks a lot. It was a super intuitive, very clear presentation. I wonder, when you go to estimate these things, just because they are very high dimensional, you do some sort of regularization, right? And because you're interested in the second order properties, is there a post-selection issue, like the variances you're estimating, and you're using them later for the correlations? Does that matter? Or?
Definitely. So we're at the surface of this. Yep. So that definitely is post-selection can definitely be an issue. Definitely. Yes.
Any other questions, please?
Well, here's a question about when the frequencies are divided into these bands, and I assume that there's some noise in the process somewhere. So when you have frequencies that are close to the edge of one of the bands and perhaps go into the other, is there any chance they bleed in and out?
Definitely. Definitely, yes. So in fact, selecting a filter is a starting point to get all these different oscillations. And your filter choice can have an impact on the downstream analysis. So in this paper, we talked about the Butterworth filter of order 10. And from empirical work, it seems to be doing quote unquote fine, but never going to be perfect. There's going to be some bleeding. That's first of all. And then secondly is that, these frequency bands of delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, these are, I would say, ad hoc. These were derived by neuroscientists. And so now, and this is acceptable. This is accepted. However, it's still not the most satisfying thing, because sometimes the true frequency may not be on these bands. So Guillermo, in fact, John visited KAUST, and one of the students there is Guillermo. And Guillermo is working on a model where he allows the data to identify where those frequency peaks actually occur and the band of those peaks. So you see when I say delta is 0 to 4, it's 4 hertz. Theta 4 to 8, it's 4 hertz. Gamma is high. Beta is a broader range. But these are ad hoc, right? So with this work on Bayesian modeling, then he's able to identify how many peaks there are and where those peaks occur, and then the bandwidths of those peaks. Others are very narrow, others can be broader, and it's doing it using second-order autoregressive processes. Dennis.
I seem to the slide that you say about the high dimensional,
Yes.
but you have 3 references. big var, lasso and least square estimates. You explained a little bit lasso, which is quite standard.
What happened?
Oh.
Why is
The
that?
third one is Spike's Slab. So have you tried Spike's Slab because it's closer to what I'm doing? So have you tried that?
Yes. So so there's a paper on the spike and slab approach. So it's computationally more intensive than the lasso. So for simple settings, it's working out okay.
So you use MCMC to do the Spike's
Yeah,
Slab?
exactly.
And
Yes.
the SSVS setup or something different? The SSVS is the Matalo from George, stochastic set by observation.
No,
Or
I think.
something similar.
Oh, yeah, well, we're using the one by George. By George, yes.
Okay. What about the EMVS? Have you tried that? Which is
No.
faster?
No,
It's
we
closer
haven't.
to the lasso approach with
Yes. So that might be a good thing to explore. Yeah, we need to do something fast and reasonable because
That's
such a
what
bit
I'm
online,
saying.
right?
And if you have done SSVS, EMVS is easy to implement. The mentality is similar. You just change the MCMC stuff to EM.
Oh, I see. Okay, okay, yes. Well, maybe we can chat about that offline. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And I would like you to return again to this nice graph that I asked you, because it was very
In the
interesting.
seizure,
Yeah, it was very interesting. It's more related to cognitive function.
Ah, like this
so the interesting part, in my opinion, is when you don't have a seizure and you take the whole data, everything in the correlation, everything is connected. But when you break it down to alpha, gamma, then you see some patterns
yes.
which are not very well connected. So I don't know if there is something explaining this, something if these different frequencies are connected to different cognitive functions.
Yeah, yes. So there are, so for example, the alpha band, you see it activated when you close your eyes. And that's why people who do yoga, whenever you do a recording of them, they close their eyes, they have a very prominent alpha band.
Fantastic.
Yes.
So there is an explanation.
There's an explanation, yes, yes. And then beta is typically for cognition, trying to process information. Delta is for sleeping. So whenever one dozes off, then the brain waves are characterized, not dominated by low frequency.
That's very interesting, actually. Very interesting. Okay, thanks.
Vangelis?
I'm somehow intrigued by this process with the AUEB, the composition. I'm not knowledgeable at all. Is there any way to detect of such processes in the higher order spectra? No, because they're not stationary.
Yes, not in the higher order spectra. So maybe the one thing that you might find interesting is the work by Subarao at Texas A&M. So what they did was that to test for stationarity. So under stationarity, the different Fourier coefficients at different frequencies have to be uncorrelated, right? And so they develop a test for non-stationarity by looking at the magnitude of these. So they build this matrix of exactly, yes, and then they sum all the off diagonals, and so this is how they test for non-stationarity. Correct. Yes, that's right.
So I guess if there are no other questions, I don't see any in Teams as well. Let's thank the speaker again for this very interesting talk. Thank you. And
Thank you very much for letting me here. So I guess I just okay. Thanks for coming, guys. Some people in my group are there. Oh,
goodbye.
Yeah, there were quite a few people connected, I think. About 30.